Hey folks, welcome back to Canada's Boxing Channel. It's Monday morning, and as usual, I'll say that if the work week is starting for you, let's hope you have a fabulous week. If you're looking for work, let's hope you find it. And if you're happily retired, well, every day is Saturday and I like bacon. Anyhow, to boxing. An interesting question that's been asked of me, and obviously asked of lots of people, I guess, is Oleksandr Usyk an all-time great? And I think it's actually a really good question to ask. There are some people who are jumping to say, oh, he is the best ever. He's absolutely the number one heavyweight of all time. And then there are other people who say, oh yeah, he's a top 10 or top 5. And there's even polls out there online now asking the question, is Oleksandr Usyk, top 5 or higher or top 10? And I think a lot of these questions and the declarative statements are possibly a little premature. Allow me to explain. If you've seen my channel before, you know that I'm a huge Oleksandr Usyk fan. Absolutely Team Usyk all the way. And I would say that, if you're a fan of boxing, how could you not be a fan of Oleksandr Usyk, right? European gold medal, world gold medal, Olympic gold medal, undisputed cruiserweight in probably the toughest cruiserweight era. Undisputed heavyweight in the land of giants, and undisputed heavyweight a second time in the land of giants. Clearly, having beaten the very best heavyweights that this era can put forward. Tyson Fury, comprehensively beaten. Anthony Joshua, comprehensively beaten. Daniel Dubois, comprehensively beaten. Each of those, by the way, beaten twice. Derek Chisora, beaten. It's very hard to argue against any of the achievements that Oleksandr Usyk has made. However, when you have conversations about all-time greats, I think it's important that you should wait until a person's career is over before trying to slot that person in to a particular place in that pantheon of great fighters. Let me explain. We all remember Roy Jones Jr. Had Roy Jones Jr. retired earlier than he did, many people would say, wow, Roy Jones Jr., one of the greatest boxers of all time, and he would have been elevated perhaps higher than he is today, because of course Roy Jones Jr. carried on for too long. He is not unique, of course. Many fighters have carried on too long, and that often damages their legacy. One of the things that people commonly remember about the great Joe Louis is his loss to Rocky Marciano. Had he retired prior to that fight, people might view Joe Louis even higher than they do today. Of course, people like me, I place Joe Louis at the absolute top of the pyramid. And if you watch my previous videos about the top 10 heavyweights of all time, you will see that I use a certain metrics in assessing where a person slots in to that top 10 table. And that's the other point that I want to make. It depends very much on what metrics you use as to how you end up categorizing a person. Some people, and maybe some of you who are watching this, will engage in what I like to think of as a fantasy fight series. And people will say, oh, well, fighter X would have beaten, and then fighters A, B, C, whatever. So therefore, fighter X is the best. If you want to use that metric, then yes, Oleksandr Usyk is likely to have beaten many former champions who other people, boxing historians, will view as being, a number 5, 6, 7, whatever, in an all-time great list. So, for example, many people, and myself included, put Jack Johnson in a top 10. Would Jack Johnson have beaten Oleksandr Usyk? I think it's fair to say probably not. But it depends upon the metrics you use. If, for example, it's important that you assign a certain number of points to the first African American world champion, then Jack Johnson obviously gets those points. Likewise, if you value title defenses, then Joe Louis and Vladimir Klitschko, whether you like them or not, they get awarded those points. Another metric that you might want to use is Hall of Famers beaten. And that's where, for example, Muhammad Ali shines. Muhammad Ali shines in a number of these categories, as does Joe Louis, and as does Larry Holmes, and as does Lennox Lewis, for example. It's hard right now, 2025, to talk about Oleksandr Usyk in that way, because the people he has beaten may or may not ultimately be categorized as Hall of Famers. So, as of today, neither of Tyson Fury or Anthony Joshua, both unified champions, both with legions of fans and legions of detractors, have not been inducted into the Hall of Fame. Why? Because they've not retired yet. So we don't know how many Hall of Famers Oleksandr Usyk will end up having on his record. Another metric to consider is how many total fights has a person had. Total professional fights, total amateur fights. This is where modern fighters often suffer if one compares them to historical fighters. In the professional era, Oleksandr Usyk may well retire with no more than maybe, 25, 26, 27 professional fights. That's very, very hard then to compare to somebody who's had 60 or more, sometimes many, many more professional fights. Likewise, amateur fights. Now, this is where Oleksandr Usyk, of course, has many, many amateur fights. But a lot of modern day fighters won't. So it's so difficult to really assess. And does one add together Oleksandr Usyk's exceptional cruiserweight record to his heavyweight record? Some people would say, no, they're two different divisions. You can't do that. Other people would say, well, yes, because at the time Oleksandr Usyk was fighting at cruiserweight, he was weighing as much or more than Rocky Marciano, Joe Louis, and Joe Frazier. I mean, a lot of heavyweight legends were fighting at a weight that would be well within today's cruiserweight. You get it? So I think a lot of these conversations are premature. If I was forced, I would say absolutely Oleksandr Usyk has to be in the conversation based on achievements. But where is probably a little too soon. And then, and I'll leave it here, when one has a list of 10 fighters that you're really comfortable with, and just, I'll just randomly just sort of throw out names here, right? Ali, Foreman, Lewis, Frazier, Holmes, right? Which one of those do you kick off the top table to make room for Oleksandr Usyk? Would you, for example, say, okay, well, Mike Tyson is on my list, right? Mike Tyson's achievements, youngest heavyweight, cleaned out division. But then you start digging into the record and you think, well, maybe not. But you have to make a case, not just to include Oleksandr Usyk, but you have to make a case to kick somebody else off. Whether that's Jack Dempsey, whether that's Mike Tyson, whether that's Evander Holyfield, whether that's Larry Holmes, that's for you to choose, but you have to make the case. You can't just say, because I've seen Oleksandr Usyk destroy the modern monsters, I guess, these huge modern heavyweights, that, oh yeah, he's the best ever. Well, you can, but then you have to be honest with yourself about what metrics you're using. If you believe that the only metric that matters is whether Usyk could have beaten Muhammad Ali, Larry Holmes, Joe Louis, Rocky Marciano, fine, that's your metric. But then when you say Oleksandr Usyk is the greatest of all time because he would have beaten these guys, okay? But if you say Oleksandr Usyk is the greatest of all time without explaining why, then you open yourself up to, quite frankly, well-founded criticism, because you haven't explained the underpinning for your rationale. Those are my thoughts. Let me know in the comment section what your thoughts are. I remain a huge Usyk fan, and of course, I would like him to retire undefeated. I'd like him to fight Parker next and then call it a day, or maybe Parker and Kabayel and call it a day. And then we can sit back and we can say, okay, now, where does he fit in? This is a better approach, in my view, than that sort of emotional, almost reflexive comment. But your mileage may vary. Okay, that's all I've got for the moment. Please like, please share, please subscribe, and I look forward to seeing you on the next video. Have a fabulous day. Bye-bye.